How can something as small as a bird destroy a machine as powerful as a jet engine? It sounds absurd until you see what a flock does when it is sucked into a spinning turbine at full power. The engine does not simply shut down. It can come apart and catch fire in the space of a second and take the aircraft down with it. This video is about the flights brought down by the smallest thing in the sky. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. On a clear October evening in 1960, an airliner taking off from Boston flew into a flock of small songbirds and came down in the harbor in under a minute. It remains the worst bird strike in the history of American aviation. The birds were starlings, no bigger than a fist, and thousands of them crossed the path of the aircraft at the one moment it could least afford them. The aircraft waiting at the end of runway 09 was a Lockheed Electra, a large four-engine turboprop still fairly new to the airline. It had flown up from New York earlier that day and was now heading south toward Philadelphia and Atlanta, with 72 people aboard. 15 of them were young Marine recruits, sworn in only hours earlier and bound for training camp, and some of their relatives were watching from the terminal observation deck. At 20 minutes to 6, the tower cleared the flight, and the Electra rolled down the runway toward the water beyond. For the first few seconds, everything was normal. Then, about 6 seconds after the wheels left the ground and barely 100 feet up, the aircraft flew straight into an enormous cloud of starlings. Small as they are, these birds gather in the thousands and move in dense shifting flocks, and the Electra hit one at the worst possible height. Hundreds of them were swept into the engines, and 3 of the 4 took the hit. What happened next came down to how the engines were built. On the far left engine, the damage was bad enough that its propeller automatically turned its blade's edge onto the wind, and the crew shut the engine down. The 2 engines on the right side each lost power for a moment, and then came back, but not together, which left the aircraft badly out of balance. With the right side still pulling hard and almost nothing on the left, the Electra slowed and swung hard to one side, sinking back toward the ground. They had almost no altitude beneath them and only seconds to react. The aircraft veered left and held steady for a breath, then veered left again and mushed downward, its nose riding high while the wings gave up their grip on the air. The aircraft rolled onto its side, and it dropped almost straight down into the shallow water of Winthrop Bay, just past the end of the runway. On impact, the fuselage tore into 2 pieces. The forward section sank at once into the mud of the bay and took most of the passengers and the entire flight crew with it. The tail stayed afloat for a little while, and all 10 of the people who lived had been sitting back there, either thrown clear or pulled out by boats already on the water. Members of a nearby yacht club had watched it happen and raced out within moments, and volunteers waded into the muddy shallows at low tide to drag the injured to shore. Even with all of that, only 10 of the 72 aboard survived, and 9 of them were badly hurt. A grim detail came out later. The wide, buoyant seats had ripped loose on impact and flipped upside down in the water, holding people under, who might otherwise have lived through the crash. The investigation ran for years and was unusually careful. Because other Electras had crashed around the same period, investigators had to first rule out any fault in the aircraft itself, and only after piecing the wreckage back together in a hangar were they satisfied the airplane had been sound. To study the engines, they went to extraordinary lengths. They fired birds into identical turboprops on the ground to measure how much power was lost, and they sat experienced pilots in a simulator and had them fly the exact situation Flight 375 had been dealt. Not one of those pilots managed to save it. The birds had struck at a moment so delicate, caught between the runway and safe flight, that there may simply have been no way out. What makes this crash matter is everything it changed. Before it, almost no one had seriously considered what a flock of birds could do to a turbine engine. After it, regulators began demanding engines that could swallow birds and keep running, along with programs to clear flocks away from runways. Most of the passengers on this flight were flight attendants. That single fact is the reason everyone lived. In the autumn of 1975, a charter airline was moving well over 100 of its own employees across the Atlantic to work the annual pilgrimage flights to Saudi Arabia, and the aircraft carrying them was about to be destroyed on a runway in New York. What should have been a horror instead became one of the most orderly evacuations in aviation history, run by a cabin full of people who had trained their whole careers for exactly this moment. The aircraft that morning was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a large 3-engine wide-body loaded to its limit. It was carrying 128 passengers and 11 crew, along with a huge quantity of spare parts and equipment, plus enough fuel for the long flight across the ocean. The load left it a fraction over its maximum weight, so the long taxi across the airport was expected to burn just enough fuel to bring it back under the limit by the time it reached the runway. Because the jet was so heavy and the runway was wet, the pilots asked for the longest strip at the airport, a runway that had been closed for hours and reopened just for them. That last detail turned out to be the crucial one. Runway 13 right ran its entire length along the shore of a swampy bay that was popular with seabirds, and with no aircraft using it for hours, the birds had settled onto the empty strip and claimed it as their own. No one had gone out to clear them off before the flight was cleared to go. The takeoff began normally. The DC-10 accelerated down the runway, and everything looked fine until the captain spotted a flock of at least 100 seagulls gathered on the pavement dead ahead. As the jet bore down on them, the startled birds lifted into the air, wheeled around, and turned straight into its path. A second later, the aircraft plowed into them. Heavy thuds hammered the airframe as dozens of gulls struck every surface, and the worst of it hit the engine on the right wing, where several birds bounced off the intake and were swallowed into the fan. The captain heard the impacts and immediately moved to abandon the takeoff, pulling the power back and hitting the brakes. At almost the same instant, the right engine tore itself apart. This was the part that should never have happened. A bird strike alone is not supposed to destroy an engine, and yet this one disintegrated so violently that heavy spinning discs from deep inside it were flung hundreds of meters through the air, one group of them crashing down onto a storage shed off to the side of the runway and setting it on fire. As nearly half the engine ripped away, it severed the fuel lines running through the wing, and fuel began pouring out and igniting at once. Now the crew had a burning aircraft that would not slow down. The exploding engine had shredded tires on the right side, knocked out one of the two braking systems, and disabled panels on the wing that help a jet stop. On the wet runway, with all of that working against them, the deceleration bled away, and it slowly became clear they were not going to stop before the end. In the last seconds, the captain steered hard to one side, cutting off onto a taxiway to avoid the fence. The right wing dropped and struck the ground, and the jet skidded to a halt with fire spreading fast across its rear. When the right wing hit the ground, the wreckage of the engine punched up through it and ruptured the fuel tanks, and flames swept around the back of the aircraft and began seeping in. The public address system was dead, so the pilots could not even call for an evacuation, but they did not need to. The cabin crew opened the doors on their own the instant the aircraft stopped. One exit was blocked by smoke, so they opened another, and every single person filed out through that one door, leaving their belongings behind and jumping down the slide without hesitation, exactly as their training demanded. The flight crew climbed down a rope from a cockpit window. Within a very short time, the aircraft was empty. The DC-10 burned for 36 hours before firefighters could put it out, leaving almost nothing but the tail and a heap of ash. And yet every one of the 139 people aboard walked away with only minor injuries, the most serious being a sprained foot. The investigation that followed spent a long time on a puzzle that mattered far beyond this one flight. The engine had come apart far more violently than a bird strike should ever cause, and the reason turned out to be strange and unsettling. When the birds damaged the fan, they threw it off balance, and the wobbling blades began grinding against a soft protective lining inside the engine, scraping it away into a fine powder. That powder was swept deeper into the engine, where the intense heat and pressure set it off like the dust explosion that can level a grain silo. It was a freak sequence, possible only within a narrow band of damage, which is why no one had ever seen it before. The changes that came out of it reached in several directions. The flammable engine lining was replaced with a material that would not ignite that way. Rules for aircraft tires, wheels, and brakes were revised, and the airport was ordered to sweep any runway for birds before reopening it to traffic, the very step that had been skipped that day. The blast fence at the end of the runway was eventually removed as well. It stands as one of the rare disasters remembered not for who was lost, but for how a cabin full of the right people turned a burning wreck into a story with no funerals. A passenger jet sitting intact in the middle of a cornfield is a strange sight. There is no fire and no scattered wreckage, just a large airliner resting on its belly among the tall stalks, its passengers wandering out into the early morning sun. That was the scene outside Moscow, one August morning in 2019, and within hours, the whole country was calling it a miracle. Everyone aboard had survived, but the story behind that peaceful image was more complicated than the headlines made it sound. The flight was nearly full that morning, an Airbus A321 carrying 233 people. It was setting off from a Moscow airport bound for Crimea in the soft light before sunrise. In the cockpit sat an experienced captain and a young first officer with only about a year on the job. Their departure looked entirely ordinary, right up until the moment the wheels left the runway. As the jet rotated into the air, it flew straight into a flock of gulls. These were not small birds. Each of them weighed enough to fall into the category that engines are only just built to withstand, and there were at least 15 of them. Several were swallowed into the left engine and one into the right, and another struck a sensor and set off false warnings in the cockpit. The strike was more than the engines were designed to survive. The damage was immediate and severe. The left engine failed almost completely, and the right was left producing so little thrust that between the two of them, the aircraft had less power than a single working engine would have given. This put the jet into a situation that had never even been imagined when it was certified to fly. It was barely 300 feet in the air, heavy and sinking, with two crippled engines, and no realistic way to climb or turn back. The pilots had only seconds and very few options. Directly ahead lay a large cornfield, flat and open, and they aimed for it. To reduce drag and stretch their descent as far as they could, they left the landing gear up and brought the aircraft down onto its belly. It touched down among the corn at around 140 knots, the right engine scraping the ground first, then the fuselage settling into the stalks. The jet slid through the field and across a watery ditch before coming to rest still in one piece, with no fire at all. The cabin crew went straight to work. They threw open the doors and deployed the escape slides, calling out over loudspeakers for passengers to leave their bags behind. And one after another, the survivors climbed down into the field. Everyone got out. Of the 233 aboard, not one was killed, though dozens were hurt in the crash. Some were injured seriously. Rescuers soon cut a path through the corn to reach them, and the injured were taken to hospital while the rest were bussed back to the terminal. Russia embraced the story instantly. In a country used to grim aviation news, here was a flight where everyone had walked away, and the authorities made the most of it. Both pilots were named heroes of the Russian Federation, and their rescue was quickly turned into a feature film. For a while, the landing in the cornfield was a point of national pride. The fuller picture came out more quietly. When the official report was leaked a few years later, it confirmed that the birds and the failing engines were the heart of the disaster, and that no crew could have kept that aircraft flying. But it also found that the pilots, under enormous stress, had not handled everything as well as the heroic version suggested. They had been slow to raise the landing gear, and they had not managed what little thrust they had as cleanly as they might have. The nose had ridden too high, and their airspeed had slipped away from them. None of it changed the ending, because the engines were beyond saving from the moment the birds went in. Yet it complicated the tidy legend of two flawless heroes. There was also the question of why the birds were there at all. Investigators pointed to the airport's surroundings, where illegal waste dumps and open water had drawn large flocks close to the runway, and to bird control measures that were never properly enforced. The gulls that brought down Flight 178 had been all but invited to gather in the one place they could do the most harm. The passengers survived, and that was real. The story just was not as simple as a miracle. The captain had only a second or two to decide, and the choice he made turned a survivable moment into a crash. His aircraft was seconds from touching down at Rome when a dense cloud of birds rose up in front of it, and he had to choose in an instant whether to land through them or to abandon the approach and climb away. He chose to climb. On almost any other day, that would have been the safer call. On this one, it was the wrong one, and the reason lay in what the birds had already done to his engines. Only 8 months old, the Boeing 737 on final approach that morning carried 172 people in from Germany. It was arriving at Ciampino, Rome's smaller airport, which has a fairly short runway, and that detail would weigh on the captain in the crucial seconds. The approach was normal, flown in clear daylight down toward the runway, until the aircraft was just over 100 meters from the threshold and only about 130 feet up. At that moment, a huge flock of starlings came up from below the aircraft, directly into its path. Starlings are tiny birds, but they gather in dense clouds of hundreds. This flock was enormous, around 90 birds by later count. They hammered into the aircraft all at once. The crew later said it sounded like flying through hail, a rattling barrage of impacts across the nose and wings, and a great many of the birds were swallowed into both engines at the same time. Here, the short runway shaped everything. Worried that a landing now might run off the far end, the captain decided to go around and push the throttles forward for the climb. But the engines had already taken the birds, and when he asked for full power, they could not deliver it. Instead of surging to life, both of them faltered, their fan speeds sagging as the damage inside took hold. The aircraft was now committed to a climb. It did not have the thrust to make. The jet rose a little, then ran out of speed and lift, its nose high, and the whole aircraft hovering on the edge of a stall. It stopped climbing and began to drop. About halfway down the runway, it came down hard, slamming onto the pavement at well over twice the force of a normal landing, nose still high. The left main landing gear collapsed on impact, and that side of the aircraft dropped onto the runway, the engine and the lower fuselage grinding along the surface. The jet skidded down the runway on its belly and its remaining gear, throwing up sparks, and slid nearly a kilometer before stopping close to the far end. There was no fire. The crew got the doors open and everyone off by the slides, and although 10 people were taken to hospital with minor injuries, all 172 aboard survived. The aircraft, only 8 months into its life, was damaged beyond repair. The investigation came to a conclusion that feels backward at first. It found that the captain's decision to go around had been the wrong one. Under normal circumstances, breaking off a landing is the cautious and correct thing to do, drilled into every pilot from the start. But once both engines had swallowed that many birds, asking them for full power was the most dangerous thing he could have done, because it pushed already damaged engines past what they could take and left the aircraft trying to climb with nothing to climb on. Had he instead continued the landing he was moments from making and simply put the aircraft down, the birds might have cost him an aircraft, but not control of it. It was a cruel trap more than a failure of skill. The call had to be made in a heartbeat, with no way to know that the usual safe answer had become the unsafe one. The deeper problem was that the birds had been allowed to mass near a runway in the first place. Investigators found the airport's efforts to manage its bird hazard had been inadequate, and afterward the field brought in better detection and stronger measures to scare flocks away. The wider lesson reached every cockpit. New guidance now tells crews that when a landing is assured and birds are in the engines, the safest thing may be to keep going down rather than try to climb back into the sky. Bahir Dar sits on the shore of Lake Tana, the largest lake in Ethiopia, and the source of the Blue Nile, a vast stretch of water fringed by wetlands and alive with birds. It is a beautiful place for an airport and a dangerous one, because the same marshes that draw the birds sit right beside the runway. On a September morning in 1988, that danger caught up with a flight climbing away from the field and turned a routine departure into disaster in a matter of seconds. The jet that lifted off from Bahir Dar was almost brand new. A Boeing 737 less than a year old, it had flown the first leg up from the capital without trouble and was now continuing north toward Asmara, carrying 104 people. Bahir Dar sits high above sea level, where the thin air robs an engine of some of its power. So before takeoff, the crew made a small choice to squeeze out a little more thrust. They switched off a system that bleeds air away from the engines for the cabin, giving the jet every bit of push it had for the climb. The takeoff ran normally down the runway. The aircraft accelerated smoothly and passed the speed beyond which a takeoff can no longer be safely abandoned, the point where the crew is committed to fly no matter what. Just as they reached it and the nose was about to lift, they saw a flock of pigeons rise into the air off to the left. There was no longer any option to stop. The captain took the controls and pulled the aircraft into the sky, straight toward the birds. An instant after the wheels left the ground, the jet flew into the flock. Loud bangs rang through the airframe as pigeons were swallowed into both engines at once. This was the worst possible outcome, because a modern jet like this one has only 2 engines, and losing both at takeoff leaves almost nothing to work with. One engine lost its power almost immediately. The other began to fail as the crew turned back toward the airport, its temperature climbing past what it could bear. Now the crew had a crippled aircraft, barely off the ground, with too little power to climb and too little height to work with. They had no realistic hope of circling around for a proper landing. Their only choice was to put the jet back on the earth as gently as they could, wherever they could reach. With the engines failing and time running out, they could not even lower the landing gear before it was too late, and the aircraft came down on its belly in open country roughly 10 kilometers southwest of the airport. The landing itself was survivable. What came after was not. The aircraft broke apart as it slid across the ground and then caught fire, and in the chaos, the difference between living and dying often came down to where a person had been sitting and how fast they could get clear of the flames. In the end, 35 people lost their lives, all of them passengers. 69 survived, including every member of the crew. That so many walked away from a broken and burning aircraft was remarkable, and still more than a third of those aboard did not. When investigators examined what was left, the cause was not in doubt. Both engines had swallowed pigeons and lost their power within moments of each other, and no crew could have flown a twin-engine jet out of that. There was a quieter lesson underneath, though, in the small decision made before takeoff. Switching off the bleed air had wrung a little more thrust from the engines, but it may also have left them running hotter and nearer their limit, with less margin to survive the shock of swallowing a flock of birds at full power. Whether that margin would have changed anything is impossible to say. What is certain is that a nearly new aircraft, flown by an experienced crew, was brought down within a couple of minutes of takeoff by a flock of pigeons rising from the marshes beside a lake. An hour before this aircraft took off, an airport worker walking the field near the runway counted 300 or 400 lapwings settled on a patch of plowed ground beside it. He did what he was supposed to do and fired off a round of alarm flares, and the birds scattered off to the northeast. When he came back through later, they were gone, and he was a little surprised at how completely they seemed to have left. They had not left. They were still nearby, and by late afternoon they had drifted back to the very spot beside the runway where an aircraft was about to depart straight over them. This was not an airliner. It was a Dassault Falcon 20, a small French business jet, waiting at Bourget airport just north of Paris with 10 people aboard, among them the head of a large food company. A thunderstorm had been passing over the field, and the crew had waited it out before finally taxiing to the runway as the weather cleared. The jet was fully loaded with fuel for its flight, and it lined up and began its takeoff roll in the fading light of the January evening. As the aircraft accelerated, the pilots caught sight of the lapwings on the runway ahead. There was nothing they could do about it by then. The jet was already moving too fast to stop safely, and it lifted off straight into the flock. At least 15 of the birds were struck, and several were swallowed into the left engine. Lapwings are not large, but this many at once was more than the engine could take, and it came apart violently just after the wheels left the ground. For a moment, the situation still looked recoverable. The jet was flying, and the crew had one good engine, enough in theory to bring a small aircraft like this back around for a landing. But the failure had done more than kill the engine. As it tore itself apart, it started a fire at the rear of the aircraft, and a glow, then an open flame, appeared behind the left engine. The pilots turned back toward the airport, trying to get the burning jet onto the ground before the fire could spread. They did not make it. The fire took hold too quickly, eating into the structure of the aircraft as the crew fought to bring it around. Control slipped away from them, and the Falcon came down short of safety. It struck the ground and slid for more than 400 meters before it stopped and was engulfed in flames. The aircraft was destroyed, and all 10 people aboard were lost, along with a dog that was traveling with them. What made this crash so bitter was how avoidable it was. The birds had been found beside the runway hours earlier and chased off once, but they had come back, and no one had cleared them again before the jet departed. When investigators looked into how the airport managed its bird hazard, they found gaps in the effort. On the day of the accident, some of the equipment meant to keep birds away was not even working, including a line of loudspeakers along that very runway that had been out of service. The consequences reached beyond the usual safety findings. A few years later, French authorities took the rare step of charging the airport authority and 3 of its former officers with involuntary manslaughter over the crash, accusing them of failing to follow their own procedures for keeping the runway clear. It reflected a hard truth that this disaster laid bare. The engine failed because it swallowed birds, but the birds were there because the job of driving them away had quietly been left undone on a stretch of ground where a few hundred of them had been sitting in plain sight only hours before. The geese were already in the air. 2 minutes before the crash, another aircraft had taken off from the same runway and startled a flock of them from the grass beside it, and they were still circling low over the airfield. Someone in the control tower had watched it happen, yet no warning ever reached the crew of the aircraft waiting to take off next, and so they rolled down the runway and lifted straight into the birds with no idea they were there. This was not an airliner full of passengers. It was a military aircraft, an E-3 Sentry, one of the large radar planes the United States Air Force uses to watch the skies. Built on the body of a Boeing 707 and topped with an enormous rotating radar dome, it carried a crew of 24 that morning, most of them American with 2 Canadians among them. It was setting out from a base in Alaska on a routine training flight, heavy and loaded for a mission that would last more than 6 hours as it lined up on the runway in the early light. The trouble had begun a couple of minutes earlier with a transport plane. A C-130 Hercules had departed just ahead of them, and its takeoff had disturbed a large flock of Canada geese that had been resting on the grass in the middle of the airfield. These are big, heavy birds, far larger than a gull or a pigeon. Now dozens of them were up and moving in the air near the departure path. The tower controller saw the geese rise and turn, but there was no established procedure at the base for warning aircraft about birds, and no warning was passed along. The Sentry was cleared for takeoff and began its roll. It accelerated down the runway and rotated into the air, and just as it lifted off at only about 250 feet, it flew into the flock. Geese were swallowed into both engines on the left wing at once. One of them erupted in a catastrophic failure, and the other choked and lost its thrust, and in an instant, half the aircraft's power was gone. The crew fought to save it. They began a slow climbing turn back to the left and started dumping fuel to lighten the aircraft, trying to gain enough height and control to bring it around. For a few seconds it seemed just possible, The Sentry clawed its way up to around 250 feet, but with two dead engines on one side, it could climb no higher, and it began to sink back toward the ground. There was no altitude left to trade and no time to recover. Less than a minute after leaving the runway, the aircraft came down in a wooded, hilly area under a mile from the end of the strip. It struck the trees at speed and broke apart in flames. All 24 people aboard were lost. There were no survivors, and among the wreckage, investigators found the bodies of the geese that had brought the aircraft down. The cause was as clear as it was painful. Both left engines had ingested geese during the most vulnerable moment of the flight, and no crew could have flown a heavy aircraft out of that with half its power gone in a single second. But what stayed with people was how avoidable the last link in the chain had been. The birds had been seen. A transport plane had flushed them into the air right in the departure path. The danger had been noticed from the tower, and still nothing was said because no system existed to say it. Investigators also faulted the base's overall handling of bird hazards as inadequate, and several officers were disciplined for it. The crash changed how seriously the military took birds. Afterward, the Air Force and the wider aviation world put real effort into tracking flocks near airfields and hazing them away from the runways. They also made sure that when birds were spotted, the crews actually heard about it. Those measures came out of this loss, and out of others like it. Every September, families and fellow airmen still gather at the crash site in Alaska and at a memorial in Canada to remember the 24 who took off that morning into a flock of geese that someone had already seen. Seven flocks of birds, and one idea that is hard to shake once you have seen where it leads. A jet engine is one of the most powerful machines humanity has ever built, spun up to tens of thousands of revolutions a minute and capable of hurling a fully loaded airliner into the sky. And it can be undone by an animal that weighs a few ounces and has no idea the aircraft is even there. That mismatch is what makes these stories so unsettling. We are used to thinking of disaster as something that requires a great cause, a fire, a structural failure, a terrible mistake in the cockpit. But a bird does not need to be strong to bring down a jet. It only needs to be in the wrong place at the wrong moment, and it needs company. A single bird is almost always harmless. A flock is a different thing entirely, because an engine that can shrug off one small impact can be overwhelmed when dozens arrive at once, in the fraction of a second, when the aircraft is lowest, slowest, and least able to cope. Look at when these strikes happened. Almost everyone came during takeoff or landing, in those few minutes near the ground where there is no height to trade and no time to think. That is not a coincidence. It is exactly where birds live and feed, along the grassy edges of runways and over the open water beside them. And it is exactly where an aircraft is most vulnerable. The engines are working hardest, the margins are thinnest, and a crew that loses power there has almost nowhere to go. The same strike at cruising altitude would often be survivable. Down low, it can be fatal in under a minute. And yet, run back through these 7 flights, and something else stands out. The outcomes were wildly different. Some of these crashes killed nearly everyone aboard, and some ended with every single person walking away across a cornfield or down an escape slide. What separated them was rarely the birds themselves. It was the small things that surrounded the strike. Whether the engines gave out one at a time or both together, whether there was open ground ahead to aim for, whether the crew made the right split-second choice or the wrong one, in a situation no simulator had ever prepared them for. The bird sets the disaster in motion. Everything after that comes down to circumstance and to the people in the cockpit. There is one more thread running through all of these stories, and it is the most frustrating of all. Time and again, the birds were not a surprise. They had been seen. They gathered at the same airports, on the same grass, near the same water, day after day. In more than one of these cases, someone had even watched the flock rise into the air, or had chased it off hours earlier, only for it to drift back. The danger was known. What failed was the follow-through, the unglamorous work of clearing a runway and warning a crew, the kind of thing that is easy to skip until the one day it matters more than anything. That is why these crashes changed aviation as much as they did. Out of them came tougher engines, built to swallow birds and keep running. Out of them came radar that can track a flock near an airfield, and teams whose entire job is to keep the skies above a runway empty. Out of them came the hard rules about when to keep flying and when to turn back. None of it was free. It was paid for by the people on these flights, some of whom came home and some of whom did not. And every quiet, uneventful takeoff today carries a little of what their loss taught us. So the next time you are sitting by the window as your flight climbs away and you see a scattering of birds lift off the grass beside the runway, you will know exactly why the people whose job it is to watch them take that small gray shape so seriously. It almost never amounts to anything. But everything in this video began the same way, with a flock of ordinary birds and an aircraft that crossed their path at the one moment it could not afford to. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura.